You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, Broadway, showbiz stories, news and gossip, with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today we talk all about director Steven Spielberg. And now, here's Julian, Arthur, and Steve.
Thank you, Mike. I'll tell you, when it comes to the history of Hollywood, there have been things I call earthquakes. The invention of sound, the invention of the DVD player or the video cassette. But I would argue that Steven Spielberg, in making Jaws in 1975, created one of the biggest earthquakes in Hollywood history in terms of changing the course of the business, how movies were sold, marketed, distributed, exhibited, and just in terms of creating a new genre of the super hit. What do you guys think?
Oh, I totally agree. Very famous story was that Lew Wasserman, who was the head of Universal, screened Jaws before it opened. The distributors had decided that his company decided to open in 900 theaters. And he said, no, I don't want you to do that. I want you to cut it in half. I don't want to be that. I want it to get to the point that a guy can't, if he lives in Palm Springs, he has to drive to L.A. to see the movie. I want it to be that. And so it did that way. They started, I can't say small, but relatively small, 450. And then by the end of the summer, of course, doubled it to close to 1,000. Huge, huge. First movie in history, I believe, Arthur, you tell me if it's right, that hit 100 million. I think it was the very first.
It might have been the first. I have to tell you, Mikhail Baryshnikov was once asked in an interview who he thought the greatest American dancer was, and he said, that's easy, Gene Kelly. And the interviewer said to him, what about Fred Astaire? And he said, well, Fred Astaire, you can't talk about it. He stands alone. He's just somewhere other than being involved with competition. Steven Spielberg, as relates to box office, is Fred Astaire or Tiger Woods, or again, the elite of the elites. He is the elite in terms of box office. And Jaws may have been the first $100 million movie. I'm not sure. It could have been a Bond. It could have been a Thunderball or something. But I did some research on Spielberg to see just how, what Steve said, how meaningful he's been to the industry. He is an industry unto himself. And I'm going to just throw out some numbers here for Spielberg and to see just again how significant he is. As an example, Jaws was made for $9 million. It grossed $476 million. Let's go anywhere with him. I'm going to go to Catch Me If You Can. $52 million, grossed $352 million. Hook was made for $70 million, grossed $300 million. And on and on. Schindler's List was made for $22 million. It grossed $322 million. Steven Spielberg stands alone in terms of box office. War of the Worlds. They made it for an expensive $132 million. It grossed $607 million. Some of these things that you think weren't even that big, like AI, artificial intelligence, was made for $95 million and grossed $236 million. He just didn't lose.
What were the numbers on Raiders of the Lost Ark, Arthur?
Raiders of the Lost Ark. Well, again, it was a different little time, but I do have it here.
1981, made for $18 million.
I have, Saving Private Ryan, before we get there, was made for $65 million, grossed $482 million. The first Jurassic Park was made for $63 million and grossed $1 billion. Steven Spielberg is probably, in terms of box office, the most singular, significant person in the history of the movie business relating to box office. And some of the movies he's made have been brilliant films, without question. A lot of them are just, plain great box office popcorn movies. I do have, look at this. Ready Player One. What do you guys think? You think it was a big hit? Ready Player One.
I didn't, but obviously it must have been.
It was made for $175 million and grossed $607 million. Worldwide, Steven Spielberg, unbelievable. Munich, a little movie like Munich, made it for $70 million, grossed $131 million. On and on it goes. A little movie called War Horse, made for $70 million, grosses $177 million. Men in Black, made for $90 million, grosses $589 million.
No, he was just the producer on that, though. He didn't direct Men in Black.
But he was associated.
Right.
He was involved.
The reason I brought up Raiders is I think Raiders, it was one of the, first of all, it made more money that year than any other movie, and spawned, of course, an incredible series, which, of course, was continued this past year with Dial of Destiny, which I think did pretty well, but probably not as high as they used to do.
I have Raiders here somewhere. I have Close Encounters, was made for only $19 million and grossed $307 million. These are funny money numbers. Transformers, $175 million budget, grossed $709 million. Guys, we're talking about a freak.
Before you go any further, though,
yeah,
because like everything else in our business, you go up and you go down. Steven has had the last couple of movies have been wildly disappointed. And now this doesn't change anything we're saying. He's great. But West Side Story, where he himself has said, I'll never make another musical again. And The Fabelmans have not been what I guess a lot of people hoped they would be. So right now he's looking for another one of his huge films, I guess.
Let's say, first of all, Fabelmans was made for $40 million, grossed $46 million, so it's a loser. West Side Story was made for $100 million, grossed $76 million, a loser. So he's batting, instead of batting like 350, he's batting 972. I mean, this guy's batting average is ridiculous. And to the extent that he's had a couple of losers, so to speak, is a joke.
The thing about Steven, I think you've got to talk about is that one of his best friends is George Lucas, and their careers paralleled one another early on. And I think they got together early on, and they decided they wanted to make movies they wanted to see. And I think one of the cornerstones of Steven Spielberg's career is that he really, especially with his popcorn movies, and he's sold a lot of popcorn over the years, I think that he and George really wanted to make movies that they wanted to see. And I think it represented a new generation of not only filmmaker, but a new treat for the audience. I think before Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, science fiction movies, for the most part, were kind of treated as second-class citizens. They weren't given the A-list of treatment, with few exceptions. But I think starting with films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Star Wars, E.T., even Raiders of the Lost Ark, which isn't science fiction, but it has a fantasy element, they popularized on a mass scale these kinds of stories for the audience. And I think that...
And Jurassic Park.
Jurassic Park. If you look at films today, it seems to me, and we've talked about this before, especially with the Marvel universe and the DC universe, Hollywood caters to that audience. Almost every major epic now, with few exceptions, is a science fiction fantasy epic. And I think that the amount of money pouring into, and I'll also include James Cameron's Avatar movies, billions of dollars are being spent. And it all started with Steven Spielberg and those first conversations with George Lucas.
I agree with you. And by the way, saving Indiana Jones, the first movie was made for only $20 million, grossed $212 million. The next one did over $300 million. These are funny. I mean, these numbers are so ridiculous in comparison to any other filmmakers on a consistent basis. James Cameron, of course, did the Avatar, did Titanic. Avatar, first did over $2 billion. So we were in a worldwide market, which we've discussed before. We're in a market, too, where ticket prices are no longer $3 and $4. They're like $10 and $12 and $14. So that's kind of like different as well. But nonetheless, the worldwide market is perfect for these movies.
Oh, yeah. And he's also a filmmaker who takes you to a movie theater. You don't watch a Steven Spielberg movie on your phone. I mean, that's another thing about filmmakers today. There are a lot of filmmakers who kind of film on a kind of a narrow band, whereas Steven was CinemaScope, widescreen, whatever. And I know that in several interviews with him, he talks about the influence of films like Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia is kind of a cornerstone of his influences. He also, as it was brought out in the Fabelmans movie, he loved Cecil B. DeMille's epics. I mean, the first scene in Fabelmans, he's going to the movie theater with his parents to see the greatest show on earth, the big circus epic. He liked to film on a big canvas, and he took after Cecil B. DeMille in that way. And he's probably more responsible than anyone to keep the theaters open because the big screen entertainment.
Without Steven Spielberg, the theater industry, the movie industry, would be beyond wounded. If you take away, I mean, it's, as I say, it's kind of like thinking again of Fred Astaire dancing. There was no one quite like him. He was all by himself. Spielberg is a force. He made E.T. in 1980, I believe it was, Steve? 82. He made it for $10.5 million.
Oh.
It grossed $359 million. By the way, this is just the beginning for all of those who listen, of course. The ancillary rights beyond theatrical release are staggering. In the days of VHS, days of DVD, or now digital, it only begins, the money streams only begin theatrically because there's a great afterlife to it. So I don't know what those numbers are, but I'm sure they're at least, they may very well be at least as much as the pictures have done theatrically.
And what that really means is that theatrically, we all know that most movies historically lose money theatrically. And most of his movies made money. So that, as you said, Arthur, when you go to television and all the other ancillary possibilities, it's just heaping profit upon profit upon profit. It's an amazing thing. Steve mentions the big canvas and Cecil B. DeMille. Steven's big highlight, one of his highlights of his life, was sitting with David Lean together watching Lawrence of Arabia, and Lean did audio video with him right there in the screening room. This is how I did this. This is how I did that. This is why I did this. And Spielberg said he learns more on that particular meeting with David Lean about filmmaking than he had ever known before.
I've read where he watched, before he made Saving Private Ryan, he watched my favorite war movie, World War II movie for sure, Battleground, 100 times before he made that. Now, I want to just tell a fast story to you guys. So in 1973, Universal had two movies at basically the same time. And at that time, I was a theater owner and a film distributor, whatever, and film buyer for independent movie theaters. And they brought these two movies up to Boston, as they did in Chicago and San Francisco and all the major markets, to screen one in the morning and one in the afternoon. The movie they screened in the morning was Sugarland Express, which was Spielberg's first important movie, I believe, beyond Duel. And in the after, and then we had lunch, and then in the after, they must have had a couple of hundred people there from all over New England watching these things. In the afternoon, they screened a movie called Sting, and after both of these movies, everybody got together in a clutch and what have you, and there were the Q&As from Universal's people. What do you think of the Sugarland? What do you think of it? And most of the exhibitors and people there, publicists and what have you, thought that Sugarland Express would be much bigger because that long line of cars. And after all, the Sting was so confusing. Who the hell's going to understand this? I mean, it's too much thinking. And were they ever wrong? Thank God I understood the Sting was a bigger picture in those days when there was bidding. You had to bid for movies. But nonetheless, Spielberg made Sugarland Express for $3 million, and it grossed $12 million in those days. So right from the get-go, he was profitable. And then, of course, from there he went right to Jaws, I believe, and that was
He did, and that's
began.
how. And interestingly enough, Zanuck Brown produced Sugarland Express, and then, of course, did Jaws. But he was not their first choice. His first choice to direct Jaws was the man we spoke of recently, John Sturges. That's who they went to, but he didn't want to do it. Yeah. And then the second was a guy who had done the Culpeper. What was it, Arthur? The Culpeper something.
I know what you mean.
Culpeper Cattle Company.
And that was Dick Richards. But they got frustrated with him because he kept calling the shark the whale. He kept referring it to as the whale. And finally they said, all right, we had a good success with the kid. He's 26 years old. He wants to do Jaws. Let's let him do it.
And when he did it, and they had, and the shark was broken, Bruce the shark. It was the laughing stock of the motion picture industry while they were in filming, that everybody was saying, they can't move this shark. Can you believe it? They're going to lose a fortune on this movie, blah, 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 blah. And of course, the rest is history. Now, a couple of years after that, me and my partners owned the movie theaters on Martha's Vineyard, and they were shooting Jaws 2 on the Vineyard as they did Jaws 1. But by now, we were involved there. Now, Universal was probably the most difficult company to deal with. If you owned a movie theater, they were tough. God bless Lew Wasserman, an absolute genius, brilliant man, just wrote a different book in terms of how you would deal to movie theaters. It was just everything they had was expensive, inflexible, and they were difficult to deal with. So our manager from Martha's Vineyard calls one day and said, they're shooting Jaws down here, of course, and they want to use one of the theaters in Oak Bluffs to run the dailies. And they've offered us $100 a day for 3 weeks or something. And I said, $100 a day, really? It's so difficult. How about you go back and say, we want $1,000 a day? So the next thing, my phone rings, and it's somebody calling from production at Universal. Are you kidding? I mean, you guys own theaters. What are you doing? You don't want to have this terrible relationship with us. We have a terrible relationship with you. It could be worse. You're the most expensive company in the world to do with. We're going to do to you what you've been doing to us for these past years. We settled off at about $650, I recall, a day, which is meaningless to the production at that point, or Jaws Part 2. But I'll never forget that, because usually you want to be diplomatic, and you're dealing with these people every day, every week, every part of the year, and you don't want to poke the bear. But they were unpokeable because they were devastating no matter what. And so we did it to them. And as I say, we did to them what they did to us. So,
Hollywood's been making sequels going back to the 30s. King Kong followed by Son of Kong, and all the Blondie movies, and there have been sequels forever. But I think Spielberg, in many ways, introduced the epic sequel, because, his movies were not little movies at all. I mean, the Indiana Jones movies, we've done 5 of those. He did a sequel, obviously, to Jaws. Well, he didn't do the Jaws sequels, but they spawn epic sequels. I want to talk a little bit about his style. And it starts, for my money, with Jaws, which was the first Spielberg movie I saw. And I have to say that one of the cornerstones for me for Jaws is that the camera's right in the water with the swimmers. The perfect scene is that scene on the beach where everybody's out swimming. The kid's throwing a bone to his dog, and they're on rafts. And Spielberg's camera goes in and out of the water. It's almost rising like a periscope. Sometimes it's underwater, sometimes it's above the water. And it's a cornerstone to his style of filmmaking that I don't think other filmmakers were doing as much at that time. He was really bringing the audience into the picture. And you can see it in other films of his. He's quoted as saying that he wanted to make E.T. from the kids' point of view. You're not looking down at the kids ever. You're always looking straight ahead at them. It's the kids. It's there, the focus. Saving Private Ryan, when they're landing at Omaha Beach, once again, he's in the water with the guys. He's right there in the water. He never flinches from being right in the middle of the action. And that's kind of a cornerstone to his filmmaking.
Well, he is a commercial genius without peer. And for in a sustainable career over what now, 40 years, 50 years, 50 years, this man has made more commercial movies than anybody else that has ever lived, probably combined than anybody else ever lived. I mean, big commercial movies. Could anyone possibly see E.T. and not be thrilled from watching that movie and crying and laughing and hoping? And it did everything a movie can possibly do. I will tell you quickly, a dear friend of mine is John Crosby, who's a personal manager, managed Rene Russo, managed Charlize Theron for a period of time, and managed Shia LaBeouf. And John and I had lunch with Shia one day in a little diner kind of thing on Santa Monica Boulevard. And he was up for Transformers, and they weren't sure he was going to get it at the time. And he was like, there's a great Yiddish expression, Spilkes, about whether he was going to come up with this role or not. As it turned out, he did. And it was fantastic. Okay, let's talk about Transformers. And let's talk about not only the fact, as you said before, Steve, with the sequels, not only the first of these movies, whether it be Raiders of the Lost Ark with George Lucas or Transformers, there were sequels to these things that did as much or more than the original movie. So it wasn't just this discovery of gold. They dug deeper with the sequels, and little Shia LaBeouf at the time became a multimillionaire from those films.
Julian, you've had some interaction with him. I've interviewed Steven, but you've actually sounds like you've spent more time with him. What has always been your impression of Steven?
I would say of all the most successful people I met, as Arthur and you have pointed out, he's the most. And you would never, ever feel that it went to his head. You'd never get the feeling that he's always just a good guy. We lived in the same building in New York City. Of course, he was probably had 17 homes around the world, but, and we would see each other occasionally. And when I was doing my special on Mike Nichols, he was kind enough to come in and we talked. I filmed him and we talked a while. But our big collaboration, if you want to call it big, at least it was for me, to him it was just, I'm sure, another small potatoes, was that I owned the property of the remake rights to Lily. And it had been made into a musical on Broadway called Carnival. And I went to Stephen in Amblin at that time and had a very funny meeting. He sat at the head of the table. I was to his right. To my right was one guy from Amblin, and across from me were two other guys. So it's Spielberg at the head, three Amblins, and me. And I showing him that Carnival has these wonderful songs, and he could make a great animated film out of it, because at that time he was making these things called American Five-O. You remember that, guys? American Five-O?
American Tail.
Yeah, American Tail. American Five-O goes west. American Five-O meets his own mother. I don't know. Whatever it was, he was doing that. And I put on, I had made a 3-minute presentation, and I put it on, and Stephen and the people at Amblin looked at it, and he goes, Julian, this is great. I love this. This is the stuff we should be doing. We should not be doing just animals. We should be doing people. This is terrific. And I say to him, Stephen, I'm from New York. Is this a pass? And there's dead silence. And then he laughs. And then a beat later, they all laugh. They knew it was okay to laugh. And we ended up making a deal. And I worked with him for, a couple of years trying to get a script. We had John Patrick Shanley took a swipe at it, a writer named Stan Daniels, and it never got made, but it was terrific working with him. I just loved it. I was sorry we couldn't get it made, but that wasn't his fault. Well, maybe, of course, I had nothing to say about the writers he chose, but I would say that I always told people who like to come out to Hollywood and want to see movie stars and
got some of them buy bus tickets or whatever these tours to the homes, is just to go to the park in Palisades as an example, and where the kids are playing Little League ball. My son played Little League ball in the Palisades, and I would frequently see Steve Spielberg up there with one of his sons throwing the ball back and forth, and he just kept repeating to his kid, keep your eye on the ball, keep your eye on the ball, which is a metaphor for, of course, a lot of things. But if you want to see celebrities, you go to the market, Star Market or Ralph's in Malibu, or go to Gelson's in the Pacific Palisades or the Little League Park, and you'll see everybody. Julia Louis-Dreyfus, you'll see Goldie Hawn, or So, but Spielberg was up there playing ball, regular guy. Hi, Steve, how you doing? It was,
So I was working at Showtime in the mid-'90s. We had a series called Directed By, where they would give actors the opportunity to direct short films with a real cast. So Griffin Dunne is given the camera, and he hires Kate Capshaw and an unknown actor named Tobey Maguire to play the lead. I think the Duke of Groove might be the title, I think. And so we're filming at the old Errol Flynn mansion in the Hollywood Hills. And it's kind of fun. Steven Spielberg shows up with two of his kids. Obviously, he's visiting Kate, who's working. And I was suddenly said to him, I said, this is the old Errol Flynn ranch. And he says, well, I'd love to see it. So I'm taking Steven Spielberg and his kids on a tour of the Errol Flynn mansion. And it was fun.
The bed springs were broken, right?
I don't know about the bed springs, but he kept on saying, now, Errol Flynn, he did the right Robin Hood. They had just released the Kevin Costner Robin Hood, which a lot of people felt was totally miscast, although I didn't think it was that bad. So we had a discussion about Robin Hoods, and then I got to ask him a trivia question. There were probably 10,000 questions I could have asked Steven Spielberg. And what I should have asked him was, there was rumors that he had photographs of the real aliens that had been killed at Roswell. I should have asked him if that was true, because I was a big UFO buff. So I ended up asking him about a music cue in Empire of the Sun, of all things, which, by the way, is one of my favorites. By the way, I was going to ask Mike. Mike, do you have a favorite Steven Spielberg movie?
Oh, plenty of them, actually. Close Encounters of the Third Kind is one of my favorites. Richard Dreyfuss in that film is so good as a fish out of water, trying to figure out what's going on. And Spielberg so captured that wonderfully with the lighting, the mood, and the characterization of Dreyfuss's character. And when he found out, and the scene when they finally make it to the mountain and the ship.
Devil's Tower.
Yeah, it's just amazing to see. And everything.
It's funny about Close Encounters because NASA wrote Steven a 20-page letter saying this is dangerous and you should not make this movie. And Spielberg said,
Well, I wonder why. Yeah.
Yeah, if they bother to send me 20 pages, I must be onto something. 20-page letter. And, of course, he made the movie. And I agree with you, Mike. I think in many ways that's a really brilliant film, Close Encounter. Ray Bradbury, who wrote Fahrenheit 451 and The Martian Chronicles, said it's the greatest science fiction movie ever made. And I think he may be right.
Saw it in the Ziegfeld Theater, your theater, Julian, in a pre-opening screening, packed house. And when those spaceships come flying in on that big screen, forget about it. It's fantastic. Even a little movie, God, throw it out. Do you guys think Terminal did business with Tom Hanks?
I didn't think it would not have thought it did business.
He made it for $60 million and it grossed $219 million.
Made money.
It's a very charming movie, and Hanks is brilliant. Obviously, of course, he's always brilliant, but It's based on a true story, which I think is interesting, of a guy who set up shop in the waiting area of the Kennedy Airport.
Yeah.
But
again, the golden touch of box office. It's so hard, number one, to get a movie made. Number two, to have a movie made that succeeds. Not too many of them really succeed. Many of them don't even get distributed. But here's a guy that consistently delivers box office movies. Really.
Coming off Jaws, he is, of course, king of the world, and he makes a deal on Close Encounter that he has final cut. Well, he goes way over budget on Close. I mean, really over budget on it. And Columbia at that time is on their ass. They're in a lot of trouble. And they say to him, look, you got final cut. That's it. We want it. And Spielberg says, I need 6 more months to edit this movie. They said, we don't have it. Our company is on your shoulders now. You got to let us release it now, not 6 months from now. And he does. He let them do it. It's a giant hit, as Arthur points out. And he comes back and he says, okay, I now want to do a final cut of my final cut. And he does. And he finishes it the way he wanted. And Roger Ebert, of all people, wrote a review saying how great the new one was. And he said, well, why didn't he do that at the beginning? Not realizing that Columbia had said, we're going to go under without this movie being released.
We shouldn't forget to say that this was one Spielberg movie that was written by Spielberg. He's the main screenwriter on that movie. I'll tell you, for my money, and I love Jaws, I love Close Encounters, but Raiders of the Lost Ark was a real, just a real important film for me in terms of just loving film. Summer of 1981, it comes out. I went to the Chinese Theater in Hollywood, big venue. It's the only time in my life I've ever stayed and watched the movie twice. I sat in my seat. They weren't shooing people out of their seats in those days, but I sat there and I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark twice. And that movie just always plays.
Stephen, Julian and I are a little older than you and Mike. And we were around in the days of going to the movies and seeing chapter 1, chapter 2 of whatever these things were. And I am telling you, not that I'm telling you, I'm telling you that what Spielberg did was he took those things that we saw as a kid. Julian, true?
Absolutely
these
true.
Chapters, these guys.
Captain Marvel, remember?
Whatever these things were.
Chapter 1, chapter 2.
Right.
And I just can quickly say, Arthur, we would go and the girl would literally be tied to the railroad.
That's right.
And they would say, come back next week.
Right.
And we'll show you what happened.
That was what he did. He
did.
That concept of black and white series, they were called series. You'd see chapter 1 week, chapter 2, so on, and you'd always leave it with a cliffhanger. And he expanded it into Raiders of the Lost Ark. Brilliant. At the same time, worth mentioning, there were 2 guys named Sam Rockoff and Jim Nicholson who were out front of going wide. They would do going wide in the 1950s. They'd do 2 war movies and they'd go wide with it. So these things have all been done. But Spielberg, what he did, as well as Lucas, is they took those concepts of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and they blew them up. And Roger Corman is another example. Roger Corman was making these kind of things in the 1950s, 1960s that have become epic kind of box office movies, later on in expanded version. But Spielberg, he's just bigger than anything that can possibly be said about anybody who made box office movies in the business. He's been brilliant. And I don't know, again, where would the industry be if there was no Steven Spielberg? Think about that for a second. Interesting.
Well, in terms of World War II movies, and as you know, I've written a book about the subject, combat films. I think Saving Private Ryan is probably my favorite World War II movie of all time. And it was not a big budget for the time. $60 million to make that is fairly low these days. But I would argue the first 14 minutes of Saving Private Ryan are the most riveting thing I've ever seen in the history of motion pictures.
It puts you into D-Day.
Talking about D-Day. And I remember buying a large box of popcorn. I did not touch it during those opening 15 minutes. I thought it was sacrilegious to be eating while watching American soldiers being mowed down on Omaha Beach. And again, I mentioned earlier his ability to, get you right in amongst the troops. I mean, whether it was in slow motion or some kind of effect, you were on that beach. You felt like you're on the beach. And for years I've been touting The Longest Day as one of the greatest war epics ever. Darryl F. Zanuck's epic for Fox in '62. Saving Private Ryan makes that look like a Saturday morning kids serial.
Steve, because he literally put the audience into the D-Day landing. But remember, the impact of it was even stronger because before you see that, you have Matt Damon at the cemetery.
Older.
So you go in slow. You go in. He went in slow, and you to watch what's going on. And an older looking Matt Damon at the time, and from all of a sudden the impact when it hits is like, whoa! It jars you, and you're literally in D-Day.
There's a little cheat there, of course, because you go from the older Matt Damon sitting in front of the cross at that cemetery, and all of a sudden you're looking at Tom Hanks. So you almost are told from the beginning, oh, that older guy isn't Matt Damon, that's Tom Hanks. And I won't give away the spoiler for the one person who's probably not seen Saving Private Ryan who's listening. But that movie just blew me away.
Well, he also took something from the Fighting Sullivans from the 1940s, about the 5 brothers who were killed
on that ship.
That scene when the car drives up to that woman's house in Iowa or wherever it was. What an incredible scene that was, and she just faints. My God! Made that movie for $65 million. It's pretty expensive at that time. Did $482 million.
Now, one of his movies that didn't work, although I think it's just hysterical, and he doesn't do comedy very often. After Close Encounters, he gets a lot of money to make 1941 with a big comedy cast. I think he was influenced more by It's a Mad, 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 Mad World than anything, because there's a lot of comedy people in that show. And I think it's a bit racist. It's a bit misogynistic, but in times it can be very funny. Did you guys have an impression of that film?
I was never a big fan of it, but I sure was a big fan of Schindler's List. I mean, I remember thinking, this is a man who could be making any film he wants, and he knows going in this could be a very, very tough film to sell, but he wants to make it. And he says it changed his life, and I'm sure it did. It was a powerful movie and film that I'm sadly have to admit, I think Arthur and I are similar in this. We kind of try to stay away from these kind of movies, but I just felt I had to go, and I was glad I did. Never saw Liam Neeson better. Never liked Ben Kingsley more.
And hated Ray Fiennes more.
Yeah.
By the way, he is quoted as saying that the movie that told him he could make Schindler was The Color Purple. He made The Color Purple a few years earlier, and he says after he made The Color Purple, it was his first serious film. It's another big hit, although it didn't win the Oscars. It was nominated for 11 Oscars and didn't win one. And Spielberg wasn't even nominated for Best Director, even though it got a Best Picture nomination. But apparently that gave him courage to move forward with his serious films like Schindler.
And once again, like Jaws doing Close Encounter with Jaws, he was following Color Purple. Before it was E.T. So he could pretty much do what he wanted.
Color Purple was made for the budget was $15 million. It grossed $98 million. And Steve, to clarify for you, and for the rest of our audience, 1941, which is always perceived as a bomb, was made for $35 million and grossed $95 million. And it was a bomb. In other words, it made money.
Well, I think it was more of a critical bomb. But if you watch 1941 today, there's a lot of fun filmmaking there. I recently interviewed Lorraine Gary, who played Ned Beatty's wife. They live in that house right on the bluff where they see the submarine. She had some really funny stories to talk about the making of that movie.
And she was married to Sid Sheinberg, who was
Right.
the president of Universal,
Right.
and was in Jaws. She was in Jaws
She was in Jaws.
as the wife. Yeah.
She's the wife, and it's so funny. I was so excited to interview Lorraine about the movie. I told her how wonderful her relationship was with Roy Scheider. They seemed perfectly cast. They hated each other. Apparently, Roy Scheider was putting her down all the time, and she couldn't stand him. It was a shock to my system. Shows you how good actors they were, because they seemed very lovey-dovey in the movie. Another one of my favorites, I mentioned it earlier, I think the Empire of the Sun, which was kind of lost in the shadow that year of The Last Emperor, which won all the Oscars. It's a very, very interesting movie. Based on the J.G. Ballard novel. Do you guys have opinions on the Empire of the Sun film?
Loved it. I loved it. Great movie.
I have no opinion because I never saw it.
Well, then you are in for a treat. First of all, it's the young Christian Bale, and Christian Bale, of course, has become a major star in Hollywood. He's a kid. I think, as I recall, 4,000 kids were looked at. Or is that might be E.T.? I'm confusing with E.T. But anyway, a lot of kids were looked at. Spielberg was always looking at a lot of kids. And what's very interesting, it's a side of World War II we'd never seen before, really. I mean, we'd seen movies set in China with the flying tigers and China's little devils and things like this. But this was about British civilians who were trapped in Shanghai after Pearl Harbor. And of course, Christian Bale plays this young kid, Jim, who eventually gets interned in a prison camp where we meet John Malkovich. Actually, we met him earlier, but he becomes kind of like the Sefton character in Stalag 17. He's in a prison camp, but he has an immaculate uniform.
But Steve, he's separated from his parents.
True.
The kids. That's the key. It's unbelievable how he loses them in that scene,
in that crowd
running,
scene. By the way, the Empire of the Sun was the first American film to shoot in China since the 1930s. And so it was a big coup for them to get to shoot in China, in Shanghai. I think they had like a 3 or 4 week schedule there. And
well, it was interesting about China. I was invited by the People's Republic of China to go over and talk about film and distribution, exhibition, and production. And I visited the studios in Shanghai and Beijing. And I'm telling you, those studios were as good as most studios that we have in this country. They were big, they were beautiful, they were extensive, they were really quite something. I do want to talk a little bit about Steve had mentioned about Jaws and casting and things, and 9 days, guys, 9 days before shooting was supposed to begin, Spielberg didn't have Quint cast. He didn't have Hooper cast. He didn't have either of them. They had gone for Quint to, they went to Lee Marvin, which would have been very good, I think, as Quint. They went to Sterling Hayden, of course, a man known for being on the water a lot, a real seafaring man, but he turned it down. And then, once again, Zanuck Brown said, hey, we just did The Sting. Arthur mentioned The Sting earlier. We think Robert Shaw is the guy you should do. And they hired Robert Shaw from that. Then Hooper, again what Steve said, George Lucas said, I just did this American Graffiti with this kid. He's really good. You should see him. Dreyfuss turns it down, doesn't want to do it. He's just made a movie in Canada called The Apprentice of Duty Kravitz. And he looks at the movie before it's released and he thinks he's terrible. He's awful. So he calls him, he says, I'll take the movie if it's still available. And that's how he got it. Now, interestingly enough, they offered for Hooper originally, guess who? Robert Duvall. And Duvall said, I don't want to do that. I want to play Quint. and which would have been interesting too.
You know, Julian, you know who would have been great as the Robert Shaw character was John Wayne at that time.
Oh yeah, yeah. But I don't think he and Spielberg may have hit it off.
No, that's true. Politically, oh my God, yeah.
Yeah,
And of course, the famous scene where Quint is talking about being a survivor of the USS Indianapolis was partially written by John Milius, who, of course, is the big military buff in Hollywood. And that sequence just today just kills. You know, Robert Shaw, who was going through some personal crisis at that time. I believe his marriage to Mary Ure was breaking up. So he was drinking a lot and he was troubled, but somehow he pulled it all together. And that sequence is one of the best in the film.
And it's been a lot of speculation. You know, Robert Shaw wrote many, many books. Robert Shaw was a writer. A lot of people don't know that, but he wrote a lot of books. And he, I'm told, wrote most of that speech. And Milius has taken credit for it, but according to Carl Gottlieb and other people, it was Robert Shaw who did.
Who was the guy who wrote in Jaws, "You better get a bigger boat"?
Well, Carl Gottlieb wrote the screenplay. I think Scheider was terrific in that. And of course, Scheider comes back in Jaws 2, as does Lorraine Gary. I'm of the opinion that Milius probably gave you the pearls and that Shaw cut it down. Because I heard that the speech went on much longer, and had to be cut. Because Milius was a military buff. A lot of the stuff that Milius added into that scene obviously came from him.
Steve and I had our adventures with John Milius some years ago, putting together the Audie Murphy project. Milius was something. He was quite a character. He did write in Apocalypse Now the line, "Nothing like the smell of napalm in the morning." That was Milius, right, Steve?
Yes.
What a line that was.
The line is, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory."
All right. How about the scene in Jaws when they cut open the gut of the shark and they're pulling out license plates? Dreyfuss is there. Gee, what a great movie. We're going to have to see that again. Yeah. Okay.
No, absolutely. What is your favorite Steven Spielberg movie, Arthur?
I don't know that I could give you one. Mine, Cheapers, E.T., Close Encounters, Jaws, Lincoln, fantastic. Lincoln was fantastic. I never saw Schindler's List because, admittedly, I'm Holocaust phobic. I couldn't watch it. I tried 10 minutes in, I almost fainted. That was difficult. But I love most of his things. I love Munich. It's hard for me to point out one thing. Hey, by the way, a little movie called War of the Worlds with Tom Cruise. You guys are aware that it did $607 million in worldwide gross? Cost $132 million. I like The Fabelmans. I did. What's not to like? It's a good movie. Recommend to anybody to see it. Loved Empire of the Sun. I like Bridge of Spies. I love the guy's work, generally speaking. Julian, what about yourself?
Like you, Arthur, and Steve, and Mike. I mean, it's E.T., it's Close Encounter, it's Jaws, it's Schindler. I mean, what an incredible thing to be able to rattle off 5, 6, 7 movies that a director has made. And again, as I point out, you would never know that this guy was what he was and what he is. No. He's just a good human being and a great talent, and in many ways has changed the movie business. In many ways, some people are not happy with some of that. They feel it's too not enough depth. Well, I don't agree. I think some of them don't, but some of them do.
Saving Private Ryan, Steve, I would agree with you. It's one of the greatest movies ever made on the subject. What an overwhelming experience that was to see that film. But there was even a little movie, I'll tell you, interesting. He made a picture called Amistad, which was kind of nothing with nothing. It cost him $39 million, but you know what? Didn't do too well. Did $58 million. So you add on to that the ancillary rights and what have you. He doesn't make losers.
Well, here's the other thing about Spielberg. When you get a Spielberg picture from the marketing point of view, you don't go in with a small little campaign. The cost of marketing his pictures is right up there. And I think that, I think they pour in the numbers, by the way, and we could probably do a show just on marketing the movies today. I mean, the numbers, if you make a movie for $120 million, it's possible that the marketing alone could be another $100 million.
No, it wouldn't be.
But it certainly can be 60 or 70.
Could be $50 million, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But they now time they also do a combination marketing with various fast food companies. They lay off a lot of that money. But remember something: whatever they spend is spoken for in the ancillary market, the aftermarkets, more than make up for it. And they create the brand, and it's well worth it. They know what they're doing. These film companies, a lot of people like to joke about film companies. Let me tell you something. These guys are pretty smart. They know what they're doing. The men and women who run these things, they have it down to a nice science. They don't get beat that many times. And when they do get hit by a loss, all they need is one worldwide hit, and they more than make up for the loss plus 10 other times.
Well, we should also talk about the fact that Steven Spielberg got together with Jeffrey Katzenberg and David Geffen and started the first studio in like 40 years. I mean, a major studio called
DreamWorks.
Thank you.
DreamWorks, yeah.
I was about to say Amblin, but
that was the first one alone.
Despite his creativity, despite his magnificent track record, DreamWorks eventually did not work. It was Dream Not Works. I mean, they had some hits, but I think part of the problem was that Steven was directing for other studios. If he had stuck with DreamWorks, I think he would have kept his company going longer. But I think that DreamWorks is now really more a production company than a studio.
I'm embarrassed to say that the movie The Post by Steven Spielberg escaped me. And just so we all understand, it cost $50 million to make. And Steven Spielberg did it again because its worldwide gross was $179 million.
There you go.
And I'm going to see it. I just made a note.
I wish you would, because this you don't have to worry about. You will just enjoy it.
Just for the fact that it takes place in Boston alone, I would think would be exciting for you.
Oh, it's worth seeing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very well done. The Post was actually, I'm sorry, it was 6 years ago. It's 2017.
Well, it's interesting because you guys did not bring up a movie that he helped produce that scared the hell out of me when I was a kid. It was called Poltergeist.
Yeah.
And, that's one of the things Steven did early on. He was such a skilled director early on that, he was able to help other directors go for the jump, go for the scare. And he had that in Close Encounters. He had that in Jaws. He did that, and he was able to carry it over in showing with Poltergeist. And it took me a while to, even want to see a new house, because wondering if there was an Indian burial ground underneath of it after that.
There's a scene in Poltergeist where he's up on the hillside, and his boss is trying to convince the father that he should stick with his real estate empire, not worry about any trouble. And the way they reveal where they're standing was such a shocker. And it reminds me of another scene in Empire of the Sun when the boy, the Christian Bale character, is flying his little glider plane, and his glider plane goes over the hill and disappears. So he climbs up the hill, and the camera follows him up one of these rising shots. And all of a sudden, you come over the hill and you look down, and there's like 2,000 Japanese soldiers ready to invade. And that's a signature Spielberg type reveal.
It was a great scene.
He's
you know that this man, I think you'd have to look it up, but I think produced now but something like 179 movies based on what Mike just said. He made it a point to help other people get movies made that he believed in and became a producer of it. And many of those were successful. And I think of that 179, he probably directed about 75 of them.
Did you all see Lincoln?
Yeah,
I certainly did, yes.
Now, going in, you'd have to say, with all due respect, the subject of Lincoln as a feature film couldn't be too commercial. Of course, Daniel Day-Lewis is probably one of the greatest actors that ever lived, portraying Lincoln. But to think that Lincoln was made on a budget of, they allowed him to spend $65 million to make it. But the picture did $275 million. Did it win the Oscar? I know Daniel Day-Lewis did.
No, it didn't win.
It didn't win. What a great movie, though. Slow, laboring, great. He just captured it perfectly. Sally Field, unbelievable in that movie.
Well, what's so great about Spielberg, as we've all said, was that it's not, even though they accuse him often of the popcorn guy making movies, he made very important social, historic movies as well. So it's great when you can have an intelligent movie, also a commercial movie.
Well, he's a world-class filmmaker, not only of the so-called popcorn movie, but again, when you get into things like Lincoln and Schindler's List, you don't have to go much further than that to understand his brilliance. So, God bless Steven Spielberg, because in many ways he's responsible for a very healthy film industry.
Lincoln was nominated 12 times. It won for production design. It won for Daniel Day-Lewis. And that was it.
I want to say one quick thing. We forgot about the importance of John Williams, the man who scored almost all of Steven's movies, and I believe is one of the great reasons Jaws was such a success.
And many other movies, Indiana Jones and other things that, like you say, I think he did every Spielberg film, but John Williams is, again, the elite of the elites.
I'm not allowed to sing on this show, but I have to do the Close Encounters whistle.
I'm not hearing you.
Maybe that's.
I think your singing is
right, Steve.
Anyway, if you've been listening to this wonderful program on A True Screen Legend, we love having you as guest listeners. We're going to have a guest host soon, which is going to be an exciting part of our contest. And we're now available on all the great podcast sites, Spotify, Apple, Amazon. Mike Faber, our producer, gets us everywhere. If you'd like to write to us, please write to us at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. We're always interested in what you have to say in terms of suggestions for our show. And subscribe. We're free.
And what about that contest, Steve?
The contest is we've invited people to be co-hosts with us. If you've got a topic you want to talk about, if you want to talk about Mamie Van Doren, we'll listen, or whoever. And come on our show and be a co-host as we discuss various aspects of Hollywood, from the movies to Broadway to television to every aspect of Hollywood that you can think of.
Email us.
talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. And by the way, I guess, can we say Happy New Year?
Why not? Sure.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Helm, report.
Sir, there's Klingons on the starboard bow.
Starboard bow?
Starboard bow!
What are they doing there?
They seem to be waiting for the new episode of Earth Station Trek.
Science, what do we know about this Earth Station Trek?
It's a podcast that treks through the history of Star Trek, from the early days on NBC to the future on Paramount Plus and everywhere in between.
Navigation, how would one find such a podcast?
By setting coordinates for earthstationtrek.com, or by doing a sensor sweep of Spotify, iTunes, or any other quadrant where fine podcasts are available.
Captain, what are we going to do about the Klingons?
We come in peace, Commander. Weapon station, shoot to kill.
Shoot to kill?
Shoot to kill!
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.